Israel Huckins had given one order that morning, and only one. Nobody was to come near his office while the line to Rotterdam was open. No cleaning, no deliveries, no footsteps in the hall. The housekeeper had been told twice. The doorman downstairs had been told once. Even the elevator technician had gotten a text at 6 a.m. saying the top floor didn't exist between 9 and 10. In Israel's world, an order was not a suggestion. It was law. He was 38 years old, and for nearly 20 of those years he had run his organization without a single man testing that rule twice. He owned the top 4 floors of a glass tower on the east side, a fleet of freight companies that moved far more than cargo, and a silence around his name most men spent their whole lives trying to earn. The call this morning was worth $35 million, a shipping contract routed through 3 ports and a banker in Rotterdam who counted the pauses between sentences the way other men counted money. One wrong sound, one shadow crossing the wall behind him, and the whole thing would slip through his fingers like water. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked on today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now, let us begin. He heard it at the 10-minute mark. A small, dragging sound. Then nothing. Then it came again, something moving in the marble hallway outside his door. Israel didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes on the screen, on the flat, patient face of the man discussing freight margins in Rotterdam. But his jaw tightened by a single degree, and somewhere under his ribs, something began to warm the way metal warms just before it burns. The sound kept coming, closer now, uneven, deliberate. Everyone in this building knew what it meant to break Israel Huckins's word. Someone had broken it anyway. Someone was going to answer for it the second this call ended. He finished the meeting the way he finished everything, controlled, precise, unreadable. He confirmed the shipping schedule. He gave the small, cold smile that had closed 100 deals like this one. Only when the screen went dark did he rise. The anger came up fast and clean. He crossed to the door already deciding who he'd fire. A cleaner in the wrong hallway, a delivery boy on the wrong floor, something small and easy to erase. He opened the door. In the center of the marble hallway, under the hall light, sat a baby girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 months old, dressed in a pink onesie washed soft from too many cycles, a dark curl falling loose across her forehead. She was propped on her small hands, head tipped back, looking straight up at him with eyes that held no fear at all, only a kind of open, unguarded curiosity, as if he were the most interesting thing she'd found all day. And then she smiled, and started crawling toward him. She was coming for him. It was not a coordinated crawl. It was knees dragging, palms slapping the cold marble, a rhythm uneven and clumsy but unmistakable in its intent. Israel took an instinctive step back. He knew nothing about children. He had never held one in his life, had never wanted to. Children were noise and mess and need, things a man like him had spent 2 decades learning to eliminate, not invite in. But she kept coming. When she reached his shoes, she sat up on the marble, tipped her head back to look at him, and lifted both arms into the air. The gesture needed no translation. "Jennifer," he said quietly, down the hallway. His voice didn't sound like his own. No answer came. The baby didn't lower her arms. She simply waited, palms open, patient in a way no adult in his life had ever been with him. There was no calculation in her face. No fear, no expectation beyond the one written plainly into her outstretched hands. Something about that unguarded trust, offered by the smallest, least defended creature imaginable to the most dangerous man in the city, cracked something he had spent 38 years bricking over. He knelt on the cold floor. He slid his hands beneath her arms, awkward and unpracticed, careful the way a man handles something made of glass, and lifted her up. She settled against his chest instantly, as if that had been her destination all along. Her head found his shoulder. One small fist closed around a silk tie and would not let go. She weighed almost nothing. She was warm. She smelled of talcum powder and something sweeter he couldn't name. He stood in the middle of his own hallway holding a baby, and for the first time in 20 years, Israel Huckins did not know what to do next. Then came running footsteps at the far end of the corridor. Jennifer Slayton rounded the corner, her face drained of color, one hand pressed to her mouth. She stopped short as though she'd hit glass. When she saw the child in his arms, a small broken sound escaped her before she could stop it. "Mr. Huckins, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The words tumbled over each other. She dropped her hand from her mouth to her chest, as if she could hold her own heart still by force. "I only went to the bathroom. 2 minutes. I swear it was 2 minutes. When I came back, she was gone from the mat, and I checked the kitchen, the guest bath, and then I heard your voice." She couldn't finish. Her eyes fixed on the small fist still wrapped in his tie, and they flooded again. "Whatever you decide, please. I'll pack tonight. I won't ask for anything. Just, please don't call anyone before I'm gone." Israel looked down at her. He'd expected fury to rise in him, the cold, efficient kind that made grown men apologize for sins they hadn't committed yet. He'd fired people for far less than this. But that wasn't what came. What came was one word, spoken low. "How long?" Jennifer's chin dropped toward her collarbone. Her shoulders shook, and it had nothing to do with fear of him. 3 months, sir. 3 months. 3 months of a child living inside his home, without his knowledge. 3 months of a woman carrying 2 lives through his door every morning while he drank his coffee and read the market pages and never once looked up. "Where?" he asked, in the same quiet voice. "The staff laundry room, sir. She has a cushion, some soft toys that don't make noise. I feed her before you wake, and again at noon. She sleeps most of the day. She almost never cries. Only today, I think a tooth is coming in." She was restless. Who else knew? Jennifer hesitated, weighing whether protecting the others would cost her more than she'd already lost. "Please, Mr. Huckins. They only stayed quiet because they felt sorry for me. They're good people." "Who, Jennifer?" She swallowed. "The doorman. The woman who cleans the lobby. The delivery boy from the market on Fridays. That's all." Israel let the name settle. An entire quiet conspiracy of pity had been running under his own roof, and every person who greeted him each morning with practiced courtesy had known something he hadn't. He didn't feel betrayed, not exactly. He felt something stranger, a kind of embarrassment that he'd been so blind, and beneath it, older and colder, the understanding that he had built a house, so silent a baby could live in it undetected for 90 days. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, and this one came slower than the rest. She looked up at him, exhausted, honest, past the point of hoping for mercy. "Because you're not the kind of man a person can tell that to, sir." She hadn't said it cruelly. She'd said it the way a person reports the weather. That was what made it land. He looked down at the sleeping weight against his shoulder, her mouth slightly open, her fists still curled in his tie. He looked back at Jennifer. "I'm not firing you." 3 words, delivered in the same flat voice he'd used for the questions. Jennifer stared at him as if he'd spoken in a language she didn't recognize. I don't understand, sir." "I said I'm not firing you." When she still didn't move, he said it a 3rd time, in the closest thing to an order his voice could manage, because he understood now that orders were the only language this house had ever spoken to her in. "Sit down. In the living room. I'm not doing this standing in a hallway." She followed him because she didn't know what else to do, hesitating at the archway like someone standing at the edge of a place she had only ever cleaned. In the end, she perched on the very edge of the armchair, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. "Tell me all of it," he said. "The father. Your family. How a woman working in my building couldn't find $2,800 a month for a nursery." And slowly, in a low, steady voice that sounded rehearsed 1,000 times in her own head but never spoken aloud to another living person, Jennifer began to talk. The father's name, Jennifer said, was not worth repeating. He had left the same afternoon she'd shown him the second pink line on a plastic test, said something about not being ready, about plans that a baby didn't fit into. He hadn't called since. She didn't know what city he lived in now, and she preferred it that way. Her parents were gone. A car accident on the interstate outside Utica when she was 19. No siblings. An aunt somewhere she hadn't spoken to since she was a child. No one in New York who would notice if she vanished from her apartment on a Tuesday night, except maybe the landlord, who noticed rent. The nursery closest to the building, the one with good reviews and a wait list, wanted $2,800 a month. More than her entire paycheck. She had sat in the director's office once, looked at the number written on a slip of paper slid across the desk, and never gone back. Israel listened to all of it without moving, the baby's weight settled and constant against his shoulder, her breathing slow, and even in sleep. When Jennifer finished, there was a long silence in the room that she seemed to expect him to fill with a verdict. He didn't give her one. He told her to go get some rest, that they would speak again in the morning, and that neither of the words fired or evicted needed to enter her vocabulary again. She left the room looking like a woman who had walked into a courtroom braced for a sentence and been handed, instead, a question she didn't know how to answer. Israel sat alone for a long time after that, the baby still curled against him, her fist loosening in sleep from his tie to rest open on his chest. He did not know the first thing about children. He knew about freight manifests and wire transfers and the particular silence a room took on right before someone lied to him. He did not know what a baby needed beyond food and warmth, and he suspected there was more to it than that, something he'd have to learn the way he learned everything else, by taking it apart and understanding how the pieces fit. By the following afternoon, 3 men Israel trusted with things far more sensitive than furniture were standing in the guest room at the end of his private wing, the one that had held nothing but unopened moving boxes and a treadmill he never used, taking measurements off the walls. He gave them exact instructions, the same way he gave instructions for anything. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation. A crib, a changing table, blackout curtains, a rocking chair that didn't creak. Paint the color of the sky right before it goes dark, not blue, not gray, something in between that he'd seen once and never had a name for. A baby monitor with a camera. A humidifier. He researched none of it himself. He had people whose entire job was translating his instincts into procurement lists, but he reviewed every option they brought back to him with the same attention he gave to shipping contracts, rejecting 2 crib designs because the slats looked, to him, insufficiently sturdy. He told the men doing the work that this was a private matter and that it would remain one. None of them asked why the coldest man they'd ever worked for wanted a nursery built in his own home. They had learned a long time ago that curiosity around Israel Huckins was a career-shortening habit. On the 3rd day, walking through a department store he had never once set foot in, sent there by no one, driven by an impulse he didn't examine too closely, he found himself in front of a wall of plush animals. He stood there longer than he intended to, feeling faintly absurd, a man in a $2,000 suit deciding between a stuffed rabbit and a stuffed elephant like it was a decision with actual weight to it. He picked the elephant. Gray, soft, with stitched-on eyes and ears too big for its body. He didn't examine why the elephant felt right, and the rabbit didn't. He paid for it in cash, which he almost never carried, and had it delivered to the penthouse in a plain box with no card. He did not tell Jennifer any of this. Not the room being built 2 floors from where she'd been sleeping on a cot beside a laundry cart. Not the elephant sitting wrapped in tissue paper in a drawer in a study. Not the calls he'd made to 3 of the best pediatric contacts money could arrange on short notice, quietly building a file of names in case the baby, Mia, her name was Mia, he made himself say it once out loud in the empty study, just to hear how it sounded, ever needed anything he couldn't personally fix. He told himself it was practical. A liability matter. A man in his position couldn't have an infant living in a laundry room 3 floors below him. It reflected poorly on the organization, invited scrutiny he didn't need, created a vulnerability he hadn't chosen. That was the reasoning he gave himself at 2 in the morning, standing in the doorway of the half-finished nursery, looking at a crib frame with no mattress yet and a ceiling that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. It was not entirely the truth. And some cold, observant part of him, the part that had kept him alive for 20 years by never lying to himself about what he actually wanted, understood that the truth had crawled into his hallway 3 days ago and closed its fist around his tie, and had not, in any way that mattered, let go since. Jennifer found out about the nursery the way she found out most things in that house, by being summoned somewhere she'd never been invited before and told to look. Israel walked her down the hallway on a Thursday evening, past the study, past the room she'd always assumed was storage, and opened the door without ceremony. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the crib, the rocking chair, the sky-colored walls, the humidifier already humming faintly in the corner. Her hand went to her mouth again, the same gesture from the hallway 3 days earlier, except this time nothing about her face looked afraid. "Mr. Huckins, I can't." "You can," he said. "She's not sleeping in a laundry room anymore. That's not a request." She didn't argue further. She cried a little, standing there, and he pretended not to notice, the way he pretended not to notice most things that made him uncomfortable, and then he showed her the elephant, still in its tissue paper in the study drawer, and watched Mia's whole face rearrange itself around at the moment Jennifer put it in her arms. The baby gummed one gray ear immediately and with total conviction, and Israel found himself standing in his own study feeling, absurdly, like he'd won something. That was how the arrangement began, though neither of them called it an arrangement out loud. Jennifer kept her duties during the day, but her evenings changed shape. Mia's crib was 2 floors from where Jennifer slept now, in a proper room with a proper door, and Israel found, without deciding to, without any single moment he could point to as the start of it, that he was rearranging his own evenings around a small, loud, entirely unreasonable creature who ran his household on a schedule that answered to no one, least of all him. He learned things in the small hours that no business school, no mentor, no 20 years of running an empire had prepared him for. He learned that a bottle warmed too hot produced a scream unlike anything he'd heard from grown men who genuinely believed they were about to die. He learned that Mia hated the sound of the blender and loved, with an intensity that bordered on the religious, the sound of a spoon tapped twice against the side of a ceramic bowl. He learned that bath time was a battle of wills he lost roughly 80% of the time, that a washcloth wielded with too much confidence resulted in indignant shrieking, and that the correct technique, discovered by trial, error, and one memorable evening where he ended up wetter than the baby, involved letting her hold the cloth herself and pretending, with great sincerity, that she was the one doing the washing. Jennifer cooked most nights now, in his kitchen, which she had cleaned for 3 years without ever once using the stove for herself. The first time, he came home to the smell of garlic and tomato and something simmering low on the back burner. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen the way he'd stood in the doorway of a nursery, like a man walking into a room that belonged to someone else's life. "You don't have to cook," he told her. "I know," she said, not looking up from the pot. "I want to." He didn't argue with that either. He sat at the island counter with Mia balanced against his forearm, one hand splayed wide across her back the way the pediatrician's nurse had shown him, and watched Jennifer move around a kitchen that had, until 3 weeks ago, been used for nothing except the occasional espresso. She made pasta with a sauce her mother used to make, she told him once, without being asked, the words coming out easier than they had in his living room that first night. She talked while she cooked, about nothing important. The woman at the bodega who always gave Mia a free banana, a song that made Mia laugh every single time without fail, the ridiculous amount of laundry one 8-month-old could generate in a day. Israel found himself listening to all of it with an attention he usually reserved for men who owed him money. He ate dinner at his own kitchen island most nights now instead of the dining room, Mia in a high chair someone had procured within 24 hours of him mentioning he might need one, smearing pureed sweet potato across her tray, and, with alarming frequency, her own face. He learned to eat one-handed. He learned the particular economy of a man trying to hold a wine glass and a baby spoon at the same time without disaster. He learned that Jennifer laughed easily when she wasn't afraid, a low real laugh that had nothing performed in it, and that he had started, without quite noticing when it happened, trying to earn it. Marco noticed before Israel did. Marco noticed most things before Israel did. It was half of what he was paid for, and said nothing directly. Just started leaving business earlier than usual and scheduling fewer evening calls, until one night, he caught Israel in the hallway with baby food on his sleeve and simply said, "Never thought I'd see the day," and walked off before Israel could decide whether that required a response. It became, in its unremarkable way, a life. Not the one Israel had built brick by brick for 20 years, engineered for control, and closed off from anything that could be used against him. A smaller one, running underneath it, made of bath time and pasta, and a baby's fist closing reflexively around whatever was closest, his tie, his finger, once, memorably, an entire fistful of his hair. He did not examine it too closely. He had learned, in this at least, to let something exist without immediately needing to know what it would cost him. The fever started a little after midnight, the way these things always seem to, waiting until the house was dark and quiet enough that panic had nothing else to compete with. Jennifer found him first. Israel had taken to leaving his door open on the nights he could hear the monitor from his own room, a habit he hadn't announced to anyone and hoped no one had noticed. Standing over the crib with the back of 2 fingers pressed to Mia's forehead, his jaw set in the particular stillness he wore when something needed solving and hadn't been solved yet. "She's warm," he said, before Jennifer had fully crossed the threshold. "Too warm." They took her temperature together, both of them hovering over the same thermometer, like it might give a different answer if they looked hard enough. 101. "Not an emergency," Jennifer said, her voice steadier than her hands. Teething fevers ran like this sometimes. She'd read about it. It would break by morning most likely, but Israel had already pulled up the number for one of the 3 pediatric contacts he'd quietly collected weeks earlier, and by 12:40, he had a doctor on the phone at an hour most doctors didn't answer for anyone, walking him through infant Tylenol dosing in a voice that suggested she'd been paid handsomely enough not to ask why a man like him needed to know this at midnight. Mia cried for a while, the thin, exhausted cry of a baby too uncomfortable to sleep and too tired to stay properly awake, and then, held upright against Israel's chest because she seemed to settle better vertical, she finally quieted into something closer to rest. He walked the length of the nursery with her for the better part of an hour, slow laps past the crib and the rocking chair and the window with its view of a city he owned pieces of, and somewhere in that hour Jennifer stopped hovering by the door and sat down in the rocking chair instead, watching him. "You didn't have to do all this," she said eventually. "The doctor. Any of it. I know. You could have just let me handle it. I know that too." He didn't stop walking. "I didn't want to." She was quiet for a while after that, and he thought the conversation had ended there, the way most conversations in that house tended to end, with something true said plainly, and then left alone. But she kept sitting there instead of excusing herself to bed, and eventually she asked, in a voice pitched low to match the room, "Can I ask you something, Mr. Huckins?" "Israel," he said. "At this hour, you can call me Israel." She almost smiled. "Israel, why did you keep us? Really? You could have found me a severance and a good reference, and never thought about either of us again. Men like you don't build nurseries for other people's children." He kept walking a moment before he answered, Mia's breath slowing against his collarbone, warm and even now, the fever starting to loosen its grip. "My mother worked 2 jobs, he said finally. Cleaned offices at night, waited tables during the day. My father wasn't around for most of it. He wasn't a good man, and I won't pretend otherwise. She never once let me know we didn't have enough. I found out later how close it ran, some months. She never told me. She just made sure I never felt it." He paused at the window, looking out at nothing in particular. "I built all this so nobody who worked for me would ever have to live the way she lived. And then I found out a woman had been sleeping on a cot in my laundry room for 3 months because I'd built a house too cold for her to feel safe telling me the truth. That's not something I could just write a check for and move past." Jennifer didn't say anything for a moment. When she did, her voice had gone quieter still. "My mother worked too. Not 2 jobs, she didn't need to, my father did well enough, but I remember her most for the way she made things feel normal even when they weren't. After the accident, I kept thinking I'd get used to not having that anymore. You don't really. You just get better at not thinking about it during the day." She looked down at her hands. "And then Mia's father left, and I told myself I could do the same thing my mother did, make things feel normal even when they weren't. I got very good at pretending a laundry room was fine. That I was fine." "You're not fine," Israel said. Not unkindly. Just true the way he said most things. "No," she admitted. "I wasn't." He came and sat, finally, in the chair across from her, Mia asleep now, fully and completely, her small hand curled loose against his shirt. The room held the particular hush that only exists at 2 in the morning, when the rest of the city has agreed, temporarily, to leave two people alone with whatever they haven't said yet. "I don't know how to do this," he told her. "Any of it. I know how to run a company. I don't know how to do this." He gestured, vaguely, at the room, the crib, the sleeping weight in his arms. "All of it." "You're doing it," Jennifer said. "You've been doing it for weeks. You just haven't noticed." He looked at her for a long moment in the low light, and neither of them said anything else, but something in the quiet between them had shifted, settled into a shape it hadn't held before. Two people who had each spent a long time learning how to survive being alone, sitting in a nursery at 2 in the morning, no longer entirely sure they wanted to keep practicing that particular skill. It happened on a Tuesday, in the kind of ordinary moment neither of them would have expected to remember later. Jennifer at the stove, Mia banging a wooden spoon against her high-chair tray with the single-minded joy of a child who has just discovered percussion, Israel leaning against the counter with his tie already loosened an hour before he normally allowed himself that concession. "You're staring," Jennifer said, without turning around. "I'm not staring. You've been staring at the back of my head for 5 minutes. I can feel it." He didn't deny it a second time. Instead, he said, in the flat, direct voice he used for things that mattered too much to dress up, "I don't know what to do with this." She turned then, wooden spoon in hand, sauce still simmering behind her. "With what?" "This," he said, and the word carried more weight than it had any right to. The kitchen, the high chair, the woman standing in it who had somehow become the person he thought about during board meetings, during calls worth more money than she'd see in a lifetime, during the 2 minutes of silence before sleep that used to belong to nothing but the next day's business. "I've spent 20 years making sure nothing got close enough to matter. And you did it without trying. I don't know what to do with that." Jennifer set the spoon down slowly. For a moment she looked like she might deflect it, the way she deflected most things aimed too close to the center of her, a joke, a shrug, a return to the sauce. She didn't. "I didn't try to matter to you, Israel. I was just trying to keep my daughter fed and not get fired. Everything after that just happened." "I know." He crossed the kitchen, not fast, not dramatic, just the same measured stride he used for everything, until he was close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to keep looking at him. "That's the part one can't stop thinking about. You didn't try. I've had women try for 10 years. Money, position, whatever they thought I wanted to hear. None of it ever moved anything. You showed up in a laundry room with a baby and a 2-minute apology, and it moved everything." Jennifer's breath caught, visibly, and for a moment neither of them said anything else. Mia banged her spoon again, oblivious, delighted with herself, and the ordinary domestic noise of it was somehow what broke the stillness. Jennifer let out a short, unsteady laugh, half nerves and half something warmer, and Israel reached up and tucked a piece of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that would have looked, to anyone who knew him professionally, like it belonged to a different man entirely. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever this is, I'm not going anywhere." She didn't answer in words. She didn't need to. And for the rest of that evening, the kitchen held something it hadn't held before, not just dinner, not just routine, but the quiet, settled certainty of two people who had stopped pretending they didn't know what was happening between them. It was 3 days later that Israel first noticed the car. He wasn't a man who missed things. 2 decades of staying alive in a business that punished carelessness had trained his eyes to catalog a street the way other men glanced at a menu, automatically, without conscious effort. So when the black sedan parked across from Mia's nursery school for the second morning in a row, engine idling, windows tinted a shade darker than the city's regulations technically allowed, some old, familiar part of him went quiet and cold in a way it hadn't in months. He didn't say anything to Jennifer that first day. He told himself it was nothing, a driver waiting on a client, a coincidence, the kind of thing his instincts flagged out of habit rather than necessity. But on the third morning, when he dropped Mia off himself, a departure from routine significant enough that the nursery's director actually commented on it, the same car was there again, and this time he memorized the plate. Marco ran it within the hour. The name that came back meant nothing on paper, a shell, 3 layers deep, the kind of clean paperwork that only existed to hide something dirty. But Marco's face, when he delivered the information, told Israel everything the paperwork didn't. "Romano," Marco said quietly in the study, with the door closed the way they closed doors for things that mattered. "It traces back to one of his people. 2 steps removed, but it's him." Israel didn't say anything for a long moment. He thought about the way Mia's fist had closed around his tie in the marble hallway. He thought about Jennifer's laugh in the kitchen, unguarded, real. He thought about 20 years of building walls specifically so that nothing he cared about could ever be used as a door. "Someone's found the door," he said finally. Marco nodded once, grim. "Looks that way." Israel stood at the study window, looking down at the street 4 floors below, empty now, the black sedan gone for the morning the way it always was by mid-afternoon, patient, unhurried, exactly the way a man watched something he intended to take his time with. "Then we make sure it's a door he regrets finding," Israel said quietly, and for the first time in months, something in his voice belonged entirely to the man he used to be. He didn't tell Jennifer about the car. He told himself it was to protect her, and there was truth in that, but there was another truth sitting underneath it that he didn't examine too closely, that he wasn't ready yet for the version of this conversation that started with "someone is watching us" and ended with her fear becoming permanent. He doubled the security on the building instead, quietly, the way he did everything. 2 more men on the lobby, a car that followed at a discreet distance whenever Jennifer took Mia to the nursery, a driver reassigned without explanation from freight logistics to a task he never named out loud. He told himself he had time. He told himself Romano, whoever exactly he was to Israel's world, was posturing, testing a boundary the way rivals always tested boundaries before deciding whether crossing them was worth the cost. He did not entirely believe himself. That week he went to the safe in his closet, the one that held things that had nothing to do with the business, deeds and photographs, and a handful of items too old and too personal to keep anywhere a stranger might find them, and took out a small velvet box he hadn't opened in over a decade. His mother's ring. Silver, simple, a single modest stone she'd worn every day of her working life and never once complained about not being bigger, better, more than what it was. She'd left it to him the week before she died, pressed it into his palm in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and old flowers, and told him, the last coherent thing she ever said to him, that he was to give it to someone only when he was certain, and not one day before. He'd carried that instruction for 12 years without ever coming close to using it. He turned the box over in his hands now, in the quiet of his own bedroom, and understood with a clarity that felt almost frightening in its simplicity that he was certain. Not tentatively, not as an idea he was still testing. Certain the way he was certain about a shipping route or a man's loyalty, a conclusion arrived at fully, with nothing left to weigh. He didn't plan to ask her that week. Some instinct, the same one that had kept him alive this long, told him the timing was wrong, that a car sitting outside a nursery school was not the backdrop against which a man asked a woman to build a life with him. He put the ring back in the safe, told himself he'd wait until the situation with Romano resolved itself one way or another, and went back to being the version of himself the business required, measured, controlled, 3 steps ahead. It wasn't enough steps. The message came on a Thursday, not through any channel Israel would have expected. Not a call, not a warning delivered by an intermediary in the careful, coded language men in his world used to threaten each other without technically threatening anything. It came as a photograph, sent to a burner number Marco had flagged and traced within minutes to a dead end 3 countries away. The photograph showed Jennifer and Mia outside the nursery school, taken from the black sedan's angle, time-stamped that same morning. Beneath it, a single line of text. "You built something worth taking. Let's discuss terms." Israel read it twice in the study, standing perfectly still, and the version of him that had learned, over the last 4 months, how to warm a bottle and settle a fever and sit quietly in a rocking chair at 2 in the morning receded somewhere deep and cold, replaced by the version of him that had built an empire out of nothing but discipline and consequence. "Get everyone in the room," he told Marco. "Now." Within the hour, 12 men Israel trusted with his life stood in the study he'd once used only for wire transfers and quiet phone calls, and he laid it out for them the way he laid out any operation, plainly, without theater, every contingency accounted for. Jennifer and Mia would not leave the penthouse again without a full detail. The nursery school arrangement was suspended effective immediately. No discussion. Every entrance to the building, every camera, every access point got reviewed and doubled by nightfall. He did not tell Jennifer about the photograph that day either. He told her instead, gently, that there'd been a security concern, vague enough to be true and specific enough that she didn't push, and watched something flicker across her face that told him she suspected there was more beneath the words than he was giving her. She didn't press. She had learned, in her own way, when a subject in that house was closed for now and would open again when it needed to. That night, after Mia was down and the penthouse had gone quiet except for the low murmur of security radios in the hallway, Israel stood again at his closet safe, the ring's velvet box in his hand, and understood that the timeline he'd given himself, wait until this resolves, then ask her, had just been taken out of his hands entirely. Somewhere out there, a man he'd never personally met had decided that the softest, most unguarded part of Israel Huckins's life was also the most useful, and had reached for it without hesitation. He put the ring away, and for the first time since the night Mia's fever broke, he let the coldest part of himself come fully back online, the part that had built the empire in the first place, because the man Romano was about to discover he'd threatened was not the one who read bedtime stories and learned bath time technique by trial and error. It was the one who had never, in 20 years, let a threat against something as walk away unanswered. It happened on a morning Israel would spend the rest of his life reconstructing in fragments, trying to find the exact minute where it could have gone differently. He'd told her not to leave the building. He'd said it plainly, the way he said everything that mattered, and Jennifer had agreed, and for 4 days she kept to it without complaint, letting the world outside the penthouse blur into something she watched from behind reinforced glass. But Mia had a pediatrician appointment that couldn't be moved without raising questions Israel didn't want raised, a follow-up on the fever, routine, scheduled weeks earlier, and the detail assigned to escort them was 2 of his most trusted men, a route mapped in advance, a car swept for trackers that morning. He hadn't liked it. He'd gone anyway to a meeting he couldn't reschedule because the version of him that ran an empire couldn't disappear entirely into the version that worried about pediatrician appointments, not yet, not without consequences of its own. The call came at 9:52. Marco's voice, stripped of every professional cushion he normally wrapped around bad news. They're gone. Israel was in the car within 90 seconds and at the curb outside the medical building 4 minutes after that, standing in the exact spot where his own men lay, one unconscious, one worse, both of them professionals who did not go down easily, which told Israel everything he needed to know about how many people it had taken to put them there. The street had the particular wrongness of a place where something violent had just happened and then been swept away too fast, too clean, by people who had planned for witnesses and cameras and every contingency except one. He found the elephant on the sidewalk, near the curb, gray and soft and slightly damp from where it had landed in a shallow puddle. He picked it up without entirely deciding to, and stood there holding it in the middle of a Manhattan sidewalk with people flowing around him like water around a stone, and felt something inside his chest go very still and very cold, the way it hadn't gone still in months. Marco reached him 30 seconds later, already talking, already working the problem the way he'd been trained to for 15 years. Cameras, plates, the 2 men down and needing medical attention, a timeline to build. Israel heard almost none of it. He was looking at the elephant's stitched-on eyes, one ear slightly chewed from 4 months of being gummed by a teething baby, and thinking about a marble hallway and a fist closing around his tie, and a promise he had made without ever saying the words out loud. I'm not going anywhere. He hadn't gone anywhere. And it hadn't been enough. Get the men to a hospital, he said finally, and his voice came out level, controlled, a register Marco recognized from years back, from before the nursery and the pasta dinners and the softened edges, the voice of the man who had built the empire in the first place. Get me every camera within 6 blocks. And get everyone in the study. Everyone. The second call came 40 minutes later, while Israel stood in his study with 12 men waiting for direction and a security team pulling footage from half of Lower Manhattan. It came to his personal number this time, not a burner, not routed through anyone. A deliberate choice. Israel understood immediately, meant to communicate exactly how unafraid the caller was of being traced. "Mr. Huckins." The voice was calm, almost pleasant, the voice of a man who considered this a business call like any other. "I have something of yours." Two somethings, actually. Very healthy, both of them, for now. Israel said nothing. He had learned, 20 years ago, that silence extracted more from a man than any threat could. It worked. The voice continued, faintly irritated by the quiet. "I want the Eastern port contracts. All three. Signed over, quietly, no complications. You have until tomorrow night. After that, I stop being reasonable about the timeline, and I stop being reasonable about a few other things too." "If either of them is harmed," Israel said, and his voice did not rise, did not shake, carried instead the particular flatness of a man stating a fact about the weather, "I will not negotiate with you. I will not threaten you. I will simply end you, and everyone who has ever stood near you, and I will not lose a single hour of sleep doing it." There was a pause on the line, brief, and something in it told Israel the threat had landed exactly as intended. "Tomorrow night," the voice repeated, and the call ended. Israel set the phone down on the desk with a control that cost him more than anything he'd done in years. Marco was watching him from across the room, and so were the 11 other men, waiting for the instruction that would tell them what kind of night this was going to be. "Romano," Israel said. "Not a question." "Confirmed 20 minutes ago," Marco said quietly. "One of the plates from the street matches a warehouse he's used before. East Riverside. We've had eyes on it for an hour." Israel looked down at the elephant still in his hand, small and soft and utterly wrong against the hard lines of his desk, his phone. The maps Marco was already spreading across the table. He set it down, carefully, in the center drawer he kept locked, the one that held nothing else that mattered as much. "We're not waiting until tomorrow night," he said. "We move tonight. Get me everything on that warehouse, approaches, exits, how many men he's likely running. I want to know that building better than Romano knows it himself before the sun goes down." 12 men moved at once, and Israel Huckins, who had spent 4 months learning how to warm a bottle and read a fever and hold something fragile without breaking it, felt the old cold certainty settle back over him completely, the one that had built an empire and buried every man foolish enough to test it, because somewhere across the river, in a warehouse he was about to learn better than the men guarding it, was the only thing left in his life he had ever been entirely unwilling to lose. By 9 that night, Israel knew the warehouse better than the men guarding it. 3 exits, one of them bricked over and useless. A loading dock on the riverside, unguarded until 11, when a shift change left it thin for exactly 4 minutes. 2 men on the roof with a clear line on the front approach, 6 more inside by Marco's count. Romano himself somewhere in the back office where the thermal imaging showed the only room with lights left burning. Israel wore a vest under his jacket and carried nothing that could be traced back to him if the night went wrong, which was as close as a man in his position came to admitting the night might go wrong. He didn't say much in the car. Marco drove, and the 11 other men rode in 2 vehicles behind them, silent, professional, the particular quiet of men who had done this before and understood exactly what was at stake this time in a way that made the usual jokes feel wrong in their mouths. They went in through the loading dock during the 4-minute window, and it stayed clean for the first 90 seconds. 2 men down without a sound, the kind of quiet, efficient work Israel's people had built their reputation on. Then someone upstairs radioed a check-in that got no answer, and the quiet ended all at once. Gunfire opening up from the second-floor gallery that ringed the warehouse floor, and Israel went low behind a stack of shipping containers with his heart doing something it hadn't done in years. Not fear exactly, but its close cousin, sharpened by the knowledge of exactly who was in that back office and what losing this floor would cost. Marco and 4 men pushed the gallery, methodical, taking it room by room the way they'd planned it that afternoon. Israel moved for the back office with 3 men flanking him, and it was there, in the last stretch of open floor before the office door, that he heard Jennifer scream. He didn't think. He would tell himself later, in the hospital, in the weeks after, that a smarter man would have waited for the room to be cleared first, would have let his people go in ahead of him the way 20 years of discipline had trained him to. He didn't wait. He went through the door with his weapon already up and found Jennifer on her knees in the corner, Mia held tight against her chest with both arms, and Romano standing over both of them with a gun leveled at Jennifer's head and an expression that suggested he'd been waiting all night for exactly this entrance. "There he is," Romano said, almost pleasant, the same voice from the phone call. "I was starting to think you'd send someone else to do this." "Let them go," Israel said. "This is between us." "It stopped being between us the day you turned soft over another man's baby." Romano's aim didn't waver. "I'll admit, I didn't expect it to work this well. Didn't think the great Israel Huckins actually had a weak spot until my men told me they'd watched you carry a diaper bag." Israel kept his weapon trained, steady, his voice steadier still. "You're not walking out of this room. Neither is she if you—" The shot came before Romano finished the sentence, and it came from the wrong direction. Not from Israel, who hadn't fired yet, calculating angles with Jennifer and Mia too close to the line, but from Romano's own hand, jerking sideways at the sound of Marco's team breaking through the gallery above, a reflexive squeeze on a trigger already half-pulled. Israel saw it happen in the fraction of a second that mattered most, the barrel swinging, not deliberately but wildly, toward Jennifer and the child curled against her, and he moved without any conscious decision to move, the way a man moves when his body has already decided something his mind hasn't caught up to yet. He put himself between the muzzle and the corner where Jennifer knelt. The bullet took him high in the shoulder, spun him half around, and put him on the ground hard enough that the room went white at the edges for a second. He heard Jennifer scream again, closer now, heard Mia crying, heard 3 more shots that weren't his and understood, distantly, through the roar in his ears, that his own men had finished it, Romano down and down for good, in the same corner he'd chosen to make his last stand. Marco was at his side almost instantly, pressing a hand hard against the wound, shouting something at the men behind him about a medic, about the car, about pressure and time, and how far the nearest hospital was. Israel heard all of it from somewhere that felt increasingly far away, the warehouse ceiling swimming above him, the smell of gun smoke and old motor oil filling his lungs. And then Jennifer's face was above him instead, Mia still clutched against her chest with one arm, her other hand pressed flat against his cheek, tears running freely now that there was nothing left to fight through to reach him. "You idiot," she said, half sob, half something that might have been a laugh in a different room, a different night. "You absolute idiot. Told you." Israel managed, the words costing more than they should have. "Not going anywhere." "Shut up," Jennifer said, pressing her forehead briefly to his. "Just shut up and stay awake." He held onto her voice the way he'd once held onto a company ledger, the only fixed point in a room that had started spinning, her voice, and somewhere close to his chest, one small hand reaching out from the circle of her mother's arms, fingers opening and closing on nothing, the same universal gesture from a marble hallway 4 months ago, except this time it was Israel who couldn't lift his arms to answer it. And the last thing he registered clearly before the room went dark at the edges was Mia's small fingers finally closing around one of his, holding on exactly as tightly as he had once held onto her. He woke to a white ceiling, a steady beeping he didn't recognize at first as his own heartbeat, and Jennifer asleep in a chair pulled close to the bed, her hand wrapped around his uninjured one even in sleep, like she hadn't been willing to let go once in however many hours had passed. The surgeon told him later that the bullet had missed anything that would have made this a different kind of conversation by less than an inch, a shattered piece of his collarbone, a torn muscle that would need months of physical therapy, a scar he'd carry for the rest of his life in a place his tailored shirts would always cover. He'd been lucky, the surgeon said, in the flat, professional tone of a man who delivered that line often and meant it every time. Israel didn't feel lucky, exactly. He felt something closer to certain. The same certainty he'd felt turning his mother's ring over in his hands weeks earlier, except sharper now, forged in a warehouse instead of a quiet bedroom, tempered by the specific and total clarity of a man who had, for one full second on a concrete floor, believed he might not get to say the things he still needed to say. Jennifer stayed at the hospital for 4 days, splitting her hours between his room and Mia, who spent most of that stretch being watched over by 2 of Israel's most trusted people in a penthouse that suddenly felt, to all of them, too large and too quiet without a baby's noise running underneath it. When they finally discharged him, arm in a sling, shoulder wrapped tight, under strict instructions he had every intention of ignoring within a week. Jennifer drove him home herself, refusing the driver, saying she wanted the 10 minutes alone with him before the house filled up again with security and staff and the ordinary machinery of his life. He walked through his own front door slower than he wanted to, favoring the shoulder, and heard Mia before he saw her. A string of delighted, wordless babbling from the living room, the sound of small feet not yet steady enough for real walking but determined anyway, cruising along the edge of the sofa with one hand. She saw him in the doorway and stopped, the way she'd stopped once before in a marble hallway 4 months ago, studying him with the same open, unguarded curiosity that had first cracked something loose in his chest. Then her face broke into the crooked, two-toothed smile he'd learned to recognize as her best one, and she let go of the sofa entirely, wobbling forward on legs that had gotten sturdier than he remembered, arms already lifting toward him the way they had that very first day. Data. The word landed in the room and stopped everything in it. Israel went very still, his good hand braced against the doorframe, and looked at Jennifer, who had gone equally still, one hand pressed to her mouth in an expression he recognized from a different hallway, on a different day, except this time there was nothing to apologize for. "Say it again," he said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. Mia, delighted with the reaction she'd gotten, obliged immediately and repeatedly, patting both hands against his knee once he'd lowered himself carefully to the floor beside her, ignoring every instruction the surgeon had given him about bending. Dada. 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 He pulled her into his good arm, careful of the sling, and felt the same small fist close reflexively around the collar of his shirt that had once closed around a silk tie in a marble hallway, and understood, holding her, that whatever he had been before that morning, the man who signed execution orders, the man 20 years of enemies had learned to fear without exception, none of it had prepared him for how completely one small word could rearrange a man's chest. Jennifer knelt beside them on the floor, laughing and crying at the same time in the particular way she'd started doing more often since that night in the warehouse, and Israel looked at her over Mia's dark curls and understood that he wasn't waiting anymore. "Stay there," he said. "I'm not going anywhere," Jennifer said, using his own words back at him, and something about the echo of it settled the last uncertain thing in his chest. He made his way, slower than he liked, to the study, and came back with the small velvet box he'd carried out of the safe 3 separate times over the past 2 months, without ever finding the right moment. He got down on one knee in his own living room, which cost his shoulder considerably more than it should have, and which he did not care about at all, Mia babbling happily beside him, patting the box with open curiosity until he gently moved her hand away. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it. "She told me to give it to someone only when I was certain. I've been certain since a Tuesday 4 months ago, standing in my kitchen, and I was too much of a coward to say it before something almost took you both away from me." He held the ring steady despite the tremor the pain medication hadn't quite managed to smooth out. "Jennifer Slayton, marry me." She didn't answer right away. She was crying too hard for words, the good kind, the kind that came with both hands pressed over her mouth and her whole body nodding before her voice caught up, and then she said yes, twice, 3 times, kneeling down to meet him at his level so she could kiss him properly, careful of the sling, while Mia squirmed happily between them, patting at both their faces with small determined hands, saying the only word that seemed to matter to her at all, over and over, delighted with how much power it apparently held. Dada. Dada. Dada.